This video is sponsored by VESSI. Usually when I cover an old school classic, I always like to begin by placing most of my emphasis on the original before diving into its remake. However, The Haunting is going to be one of those rare exceptions because while I respect the efforts of the 1963 original in delivering a remarkably elaborate production, it's not exactly the most exciting film to discuss in detail. The 1999 remake, on the other hand, is a dreamlike, eccentric roller coaster that, to be honest, is nowhere near as bad as its scathing reputation will have you believe, albeit if you go in with the right expectations. Now, let me stress, because I know what I just said, I'm not here to say it's necessarily a good film or some hidden gem or whatever, but what I am saying is that it's an endearing piece of peak 90s supernatural schlock that, for all its unending faults, is still somehow wonderfully well executed from a production design and editing standpoint. After all, The Haunting remake was originally meant to be a Steven Spielberg production in collaboration with Stephen King, but when that fell through and King adapted his script into a two-part miniseries called Rose Red, which I covered many years ago, Spielberg's editor Michael Kahn was left to piece together whatever monstrosity the director of Twister, Speed, and its dreadful sequel could come up with. In other words, it's a turd so well polished it's blinding how it represents both the best and worst qualities in a mainstream major Hollywood studio genre film. On the one end, it has exquisite practical aesthetics, and on the other, someone was a bit too generous with the CGI. Based on the highly influential gothic horror novel The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, The Haunting tells the story of a researcher who rents a house once occupied by the wealthy Hugh Crane in order to conduct paranormal research partially related to the seemingly mysterious accidental deaths of Crane's two wives, with the help of three strangers who each have experienced a ghostly disturbance at some point in their life. However, the emotional core of the story rests in one particular stranger called Eleanor Vance, an innocent young woman experiencing both grief and guilt over the recent passing of her mother, as she becomes increasingly obsessed with the house and believes it speaks to her, all while the others begin to suspect that her unstable condition is far worse than whatever hauntings they're apparently searching for. While I'll admit I've not read Shirley Jackson's novel, I do know it's most famous for downplaying the actual haunting in favour of implication, where the spooks and scares can essentially be written off with logical explanations or viewed as a manifestation of Eleanor's emotional turmoil. In other words, whether or not the house is haunted is open to interpretation. Side note, as we explore deeper into The Haunting, please make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Consider giving this a like and subscribe to boost the channel. And now, here is a quick word from this video sponsor, VESSI. As someone as admittedly disorganized and stubborn as me, I am never prepared for what spontaneous conditions might get thrown at me, especially when it comes to the weather. However, VESSI footwear have eradicated my self-inflicted discomfort with a uniquely knitted Diamond-Tech shoe that, regardless of the climate, whether it be rain, sleet, snow, or fiery heat, allow me to just get up and go, all while staying snug, peaceful, and light on my feet throughout the entire day. Heck, I sometimes wear my VESSI weekend shoes as a substitute for slippers because they are genuinely comfortable around the house and make venturing out to meet friends more leisurely than switching to obnoxious blister-inducing dress shoes. VESSIs are sustainably made and 100% vegan, just as they are waterproof and snowproof, which proved incredibly reliable in the recent weather chaos my country had experienced. The beauty is that now I never again have to worry about potentially feeling miserable in cold, wet shoes, which can also be said about hot, sweaty shoes when I enter the spring and summer months. To get a pair of VESSIs for yourself, simply click the link in the description box below and use my code HORRORHollinger to get $25 off your shoes. Thanks again to VESSI for sponsoring this video and making me feel invincible whatever the conditions. And now, back to the video. The strength of the 1963 original is that the focus on Eleanor's psychological deterioration allows the story to extend beyond a simple supernatural mystery into more of a lightly sophisticated human drama that technically uses the hauntings as a metaphor of sorts. As I've said before, the relationship between fear, death, and the human condition are common components to the supernatural genre, but The Haunting in particular is aggressively pure with this approach, given the novel practically revolutionized said genre. It largely consists of nothing more than strange noises, suspicious characters and conditions, and of course Eleanor's distressing mental illness, leaving us with a fairly standard psychological conflict where the haunting is quite literally background noise. The problem is that when it does dabble in scares, nothing that's shown or well implied is ever worthwhile, nor is the diluted character interactions that take center stage. As such, I personally find it long-winded and unengaging, with the vast majority of its almost 2-hour runtime being comprised of mostly characters talking about the existence of the supernatural, rather than making more mature use of its powerfully compelling setting. I ended up comparing it to other classic haunted house stories like House on Haunted Hill and 13 Ghosts, where they really indulge in the ham and cheese of their theatrics, as opposed to ambushing the audience with a very stern character study that I was not prepared for, and for the record, that's my fault for expecting something different. Although, to its credit, for 1963, the camera work and lavish art direction show an evident creep factor that naturally doesn't bleed over into today. For example, the lead researcher makes a point about the walls of the mansion being slightly askew, causing things to feel offset as evident in the tilted mirrors and paintings, causing this very subtle, contorted illusion to make the house seem somewhat otherworldly. However, as shameless as it sounds, I'm pretty excited to get to the main attraction because I love a good slice of remake schlock, and the 1999 version is filled with many fascinating oddities. It may not be good or better than the original, but it's certainly an experience to say the least. So, The Haunting remake takes quite the unsubtle approach to going against the ethos of Jackson's novel and blatantly admitting that yes, our house is haunted, ghosts are real, it's the new millennium, here they are to mess your shit up. It's probably best to forget anything to do with Hill House for this one, because the remake is almost entirely its own thing, as questionable as that may be. It pretty much chops and changes things in the same way as other old school remakes did, like House on Haunted Hill, House of Wax, and 13 Ghosts. Although, with that said, it's surprisingly faithful to the general setup, by giving appropriate emphasis to Eleanor's mental condition, if indeed it sacrifices the unique ambiguity in favour of whatever the hell nightmare this is. I know how this sounds, but this is what I mean by kinda liking the film if you set the right expectations, because I think the film sits in this unusual threshold between young adult and kids movie, and I'm convinced it's entirely intentional. The best word I can use to describe The Haunting remake is that it's quirky. I mean, up against the Haunted Hill and 13 Ghosts remakes, those two certainly come off as edgy modern horrors, while this one feels more like a whimsical Sunday afternoon ghost adventure. In fact, if we're being pedantic about genre, I'm more inclined to call it a supernatural fantasy than a horror movie, because on one extreme you have mature, sometimes somber adult interactions, but then it turns into a DreamWorks animated production because, well, it is a DreamWorks film after all. Hell, it feels more like a moodier version of The Haunted Mansion, which was adapted a few years later from a Disney haunted house attraction, which at least clearly communicated the audience it was catered to. I've heard folks say phrases like The Haunting suffers from laughably bad CGI, but to be honest, I don't think it's necessarily bad, it's just stylistically misplaced with the tone of the human drama. It's more so an issue of bad direction, because credit where credit is due, there's plenty of exaggerated inventiveness that you'd rightfully expect to see from an animated production. As it stands, calling it bad seems incorrect because CGI takes a tremendous amount of hard work. It just doesn't blend naturally with the moody, all too serious performances. However, arguably because it feels out of place, it unintentionally enters into its own uncanny realm of surrealism that's hard to take your eyes away from. It's not scary in any way, but it's certainly off-putting to some extent. I just find there's something weird about the slimy, organic feel of the CGI that I can't totally explain. I guess one way to look at it is, remember that scene from the original Elm Street where they used practical effects for Freddy to come through the wall, and it was super creepy because it blended realism with fantasy and had a sort of uncanny edge to it? Okay, now imagine how they absolutely butchered that in the remake with CGI. If you think halfway between them for every scare, you've more or less got an idea for what The Haunting's idea of horror is. It's basically a lighter approach to what the Haunted Hill remake did, where the house in that film literally manifests into an abstract evil spirit of vile, despicable hatred, whereas the Haunting's animation team just decided to have fun with making Crane an embodiment of the house. Yeah, again, it's not scary, at least for me personally, but it undeniably has a memorable charm to it. Now, with that massive hurdle out of the way, let's talk about one extraordinary positive, and that is the amazing production design. When we continue to put aside the film's complete disregard for the novel, the remake's version of Hill House is a powerfully spectacular and entrancingly elaborate explosion of design is my aesthetic. There's a strong argument to say it's overindulgent, but when you consider it against the CGI, it feels appropriate in its own romantic way. Weird comparison, but it reminded me of the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil. It's initially just a normal mansion, but the deeper you explore, the more it becomes this labyrinth of contrived rooms that slowly break away from reality. I love comparing the remake houses from Haunted Hill, The Haunting, and 13 Ghosts because goddamn if they aren't some holy grail of imaginative creative choices. If they perfect anything, it's an unforgettable setting. With Hill House, there's two ways to look at it. It feels imposing, inescapable, and optical like an M.C. Escher painting, as if it's always watching and controlling you, which eventually becomes quite literal with Crane's spirit manifesting within the house. But on the other hand, it seems to reflect how Eleanor's love for the house mirrors a sort of childhood wonder as she ironically feels free from the constraints her family has over her. This point in particular is an important detail because it's vividly established in the beginning that Eleanor never had a chance to live an independent adult life because she felt responsible for caring for her sick mother. Thus, she exhibits a fragile innocence I'm sure most of us can poignantly relate to when we hold onto the past. When her mother dies, Eleanor doesn't actually end up inheriting her family home, as it instead goes to her older sister, who, along with her husband, snobbishly pressures Eleanor to come live with them as their servant, more or less, showing little compassion for how emotionally significant Eleanor's childhood home was to her. As such, seeing Eleanor exude so much joy and excitement is rather gratifying when her mind is plagued with nothing but negative, haunting thoughts, which are much more noticeable in the original 1963 version.
Why on the left side?
I read someplace it wears the heart out quicker.
Well, that's a depressing thought.
In fact, Eleanor's initial introduction to Theo is probably one of the best scenes because not only is their chemistry super engaging, but the stark contrast between their personalities is fascinating in its own right. Theo is basically an alternative version of Eleanor, even going as far as to call attention to her timid, lost, and seemingly confused identity, one that Eleanor never truly had time to define.
Blank canvas. I could paint your portrait directly on you.
Okay, so moving on, there is one other negative I forgot to talk about, which I'm sure some people are curious on, because I've heard a lot of folks say that this is probably one of the weakest aspects of the human drama. So let's address Owen Wilson. By the way, side note, I'm well aware Liam Neeson is in this, but he looks so disinterested in being there that his performance does nothing but service the character he plays. The only stray observation I have is that he seems to only half-heartedly commit to an American accent before just lapsing back into his natural Northern Irish accent, although at least he figured out how to say however correctly.
However.
Anyway, Owen Wilson typically gets a lot of criticism thrown his way for his acting abilities, but I think it's important to understand where he's likely coming from because he does feel very out of place in this film. If you're familiar with his work with Wes Anderson and Ben Stiller, then you'll know Owen Wilson for basically playing awkward, self-confident semi-narcissists. With the right director, he can be strategically well utilized because while he's not the most dynamic on-screen presence, he can be sociably relatable when he goes all in on the quirks of his character. However, I feel Owen Wilson's attempts at an obvious deadpan delivery simply lacks the creative nuance to make it comedically evident. Let me explain. Wilson's character Luke is essentially the sardonic comic relief to what Matthew Lillard is in 13 Ghosts and Chris Kattan is in House on Haunted Hill. The difference is that Lillard and Kattan's characters are very empathetically established, whereas Wilson kinda just shows up without much time to interact with characters in any truly meaningful way. In the original, Luke is a bit more outwardly cynical and even openly expresses his greedy motive, effectively being closer to the character Kattan plays in Haunted Hill. The problem with Wilson's version, and it's not really his fault, is that while he is sympathetic with his natural awkwardness, his personality falls flat due to a lack of any scenes that demonstrate his sincerity, thus explaining why I feel the tone of his delivery is confused and conflicting. Sometimes I felt a joke or comment that should come off as cheeky or lighthearted instead ends up feeling more unintentionally hostile than anything else. Or maybe it's just my inability to read his character because I know people like him that have that sort of misplaced arrogance and it makes me uncomfortable to want to interact with them.
Yeah, Nell, I think what Dr. Merrow is trying to say is that you're a basket case, just like the rest of us.
Right, so this is your major spoiler warning for the ending because I am going to talk about the supernatural twist that's applied to the remake as well as the subsequent ending, so if you want to check out the film for yourself, you better leave now, and everyone else, brace yourself. So, considering the remake shamelessly commits to the ghosts being real, it adds its own original lore to establish a somewhat cartoonish villain for the audience. In the original film, Hugh Crean was just some wealthy man whose wives died in tragic accidents that were alluded to as being supernatural. It was conceptually uninteresting, but the idea was arguably to make it seem as real and ordinary as possible, as to not fall into conventional cliché. In the remake, cliché is the aim of the game, as Crean is revealed to be an evil tyrant who used orphans for abusive child labour before murdering them and destroying their remains in a fireplace. Yeah, I'm just as baffled as to how they got to that harrowing revision. As such, Eleanor is not only haunted by Crean, but also the children, who seek someone pure and innocent to help them escape purgatory, which is literally pointed out to us via a big spooky door that Eleanor talks about earlier in the film. Now, again, I will stress that the maturity of the novel it frankly has little to no connection to at this point is sacrificed for something ridiculously far-fetched, but I do like the concept behind it in theory. Sure, omitting the mental illness angle makes it vapid and unintelligent, but like I've said before with schlocky old-school ghost stories, I can't help but get a little nostalgic with it. It's just a personal weakness of mine, let's say. It utterly throws away its one unique quality, but since I had muted expectations going in, I quite liked the sacrificial ending of having Eleanor become a spiritual mother to these forgotten children, as silly as it sounds. In a way, it's bittersweet in how Eleanor seems to find happiness, but ultimately retains her role as a carer who must put her own desires aside for the sake of those who need help. In fact, it's actually somehow a more hopeful conclusion than the original film, where Eleanor dies in a car crash whilst her condition reaches a tipping point, with the researcher believing perhaps something supernatural was with Eleanor, but we'll never know. Either way, the original was a sophisticated approach to a classical genre that was now starting to expand, while the remake is everything you've seen before, but heated in a microwave. Yet, it strangely has a fatally flawed charm that somehow left me nodding, saying to myself, yeah, that's a guilty pleasure I'm afraid to admit. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this slightly trashier video. Until next time, stay safe, stay away from haunted houses owned by rich men, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.